Canada is fighting back, and they're doing it with a $760 billion plan that's got everyone talking. Even the EU didn't see this coming. So what's this bold move all about? And how is Canada planning to stand up to Trump's tariffs and protect its economy? Stick around, because this is one story you don't want to miss. At first, it was just a threat. Then it became a promise. Now it's reality. In a move that sent shockwaves across North America, U.S. President Donald Trump slapped a 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods. Markets tumbled, businesses panicked, and Canada, America's closest ally and biggest trading partner, suddenly found itself in an economic standoff with its neighbor. But instead of backing down, Canada did something unexpected. A country known for its polite diplomacy erupted in frustration, setting off a wave of economic resistance unlike anything seen before. Across the country, businesses, consumers, and politicians made drastic changes. Some boycotted American products entirely. Others swapped U.S. goods for Canadian or European alternatives. Graham's Pizza, a small but beloved pizza shop in Toronto, was no exception. Its owner, Graham Palmateer, decided to take a stand. Out went the Californian tomatoes, Ohio-made pepperoni, and even Coca-Cola. In their place, Italian tomatoes, Canadian meats, and locally sourced sparkling water sweetened with maple syrup. His message was clear. If Trump wanted to squeeze Canada's economy, Canadians would push back in their own way. And it wasn't just small businesses making the switch. Grocery stores, liquor retailers, and companies across the country started rethinking their dependence on U.S. imports. Online directories promoting Canadian-made products saw a surge in traffic as thousands of people searched for local alternatives to American brands. Canada wasn't just reacting, it was resisting. Even in everyday conversations, the tone was shifting. What had once been mild frustration with U.S. policies had turned into full-blown resentment. But this wasn't just about economics anymore. It was about national identity. For decades, Canada and the U.S. had one of the strongest trade relationships in the world. They share the longest undefended border, deep cultural ties, and a trade network worth over $760 billion a year. That partnership, once thought to be unbreakable, was now facing its toughest challenge yet. The idea that the U.S. could treat Canada as a disposable economic partner struck a nerve, sparking anger across the country. And that anger was showing up in ways no one quite expected. Sports fans, usually focused on goals and scores, began making their feelings known. At hockey games, crowds loudly booed the American national anthem. In one particularly heated Canada-U.S. match, tensions boiled over, and a routine game turned into a symbolic brawl, with players throwing punches as political frustrations spilled onto the ice. Others took their protests to the travel industry. Canadian tourism to the U.S. started to decline, with people canceling trips to places like Florida, California, and New York. Even frequent cross-border shoppers were rethinking their habits, choosing to keep their money at home instead of spending it on American goods. At the heart of it all was a growing realization. Canada had been too economically dependent on the U.S. for far too long. The tariffs had served as a wake-up call, forcing both businesses and consumers to rethink their reliance on American imports. Canada wasn't just reacting anymore. It was redefining its future. The political landscape in Canada has undergone a massive shift. Just a few months ago, the country was in the middle of a political crisis. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's approval ratings were in freefall, and his leadership was being questioned at every turn. Public frustration with him had grown so intense that he announced his resignation, leaving his party in a vulnerable position heading into the next election. And then Trump happened. His tariffs and open hostility toward Canada triggered an unexpected reaction: unity. Suddenly, a country that had been divided by internal politics found itself rallying together against what many saw as an economic attack from the U.S. Support for the ruling Liberal Party surged, with Canadians standing behind their government in a rare show of national solidarity. Even the opposition had to rethink its strategy. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, once considered a strong contender for prime minister, was forced to adjust his messaging. His campaign, which had centered on domestic economic struggles and government mismanagement, had to pivot. Now, instead of just criticizing policies, he's leaning into a Canada-first approach, one that focuses on defending the country from external threats. But this newfound nationalism isn't just political, it's cultural. The Canadian flag, which had become a polarizing symbol due to the Freedom Convoy protests, is being reclaimed by the public. It's no longer just a flag, it's a statement. A declaration that Canada won't be pushed around. Even the business community is feeling the shift. One of the most striking examples came from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who ordered government-run liquor stores to remove all American alcohol from their shelves, a move that could impact nearly $1 billion in U.S. liquor sales. And he didn't stop there. Ford also announced a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the U.S., directly targeting states like Minnesota, Michigan, and New York, where millions rely on Canadian power. For many Canadians, this isn't just a trade dispute anymore. It's about respect. Trump's dismissive attitude, referring to Canada as the 51st state and mockingly calling Trudeau a governor rather than a prime minister, has only added fuel to the fire. Now, more than ever, Canada is standing its ground. What was once a relationship built on mutual cooperation now feels more like one of forced submission. And for the first time in a long time, Canada is saying enough. The frustration isn't just among everyday Canadians. It's reaching the highest levels of government. British Columbia Premier David Eby recently declared that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. has changed forever. He warned that Canada would never again allow itself to be so dependent on its southern neighbor. This isn't the first time Canada has had to push back against Trump's trade policies. During his first term, he slapped a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum, prompting strong Canadian countermeasures. But this time feels different. There's a sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the relationship may never return to what it once was. And yet, even as tensions rise, a pressing question remains: what happens next? For decades, Canada and the U.S. have been deeply intertwined, with trade flowing freely across the world's longest undefended border. But with Trump's tariffs now hitting nearly all Canadian goods at 25%, that economic partnership is being shaken to its core. What once seemed unthinkable, Canada looking beyond the U.S. for economic stability, is now becoming reality. Faced with aggressive trade policies, the country is being forced to rethink its future. Canadian leaders, businesses, and consumers are being forced to rethink their reliance on American markets. And the numbers make it clear: Canada has long been an essential part of America's energy security. More than half of the U.S.'s imported oil comes from Canada, along with nearly all its imported natural gas. Cross-border power grids supply electricity to millions of American homes. Canada is also a critical supplier of key minerals needed for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. But now, everything is shifting. With tariffs making trade with the U.S. increasingly unpredictable, Canada is fast-tracking efforts to diversify its economy. Instead of sending the bulk of its oil, gas, and minerals to American markets, it's now looking to Europe and Asia, regions eager for stable, long-term energy partnerships. One of the biggest shifts is happening in the oil and gas sector. For years, Canadian crude has flowed south to American refineries, which depend on Alberta's heavy oil for fuel production. But the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline is opening up new opportunities. With nearly triple the capacity to ship oil to the Pacific coast, Canada can now supply energy-hungry nations like Japan and South Korea. No longer tied to U.S. dependence, Canada is positioning itself as a global energy supplier rather than just America's backup. Europe is also becoming a key player in Canada's energy future. The war in Ukraine has forced European countries to rethink their reliance on Russian energy, creating a demand for stable alternatives. Canada, with its vast natural gas reserves, is stepping in to fill the gap. Liquefied natural gas, LNG, projects along both the east and west coasts are being fast-tracked, with plans to export to Europe and Asia. If successful, this shift could permanently reduce Canada's reliance on the U.S. as its main energy customer. But it's not just about energy. Canada's broader trade diversification strategy is accelerating, with the European Union playing a central role. The country is making it clear it's no longer just an economic extension of the U.S. It's carving out its own place on the global stage. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, signed in 2016, has given Canadian businesses a major advantage in the European market. While the deal hasn't been fully ratified by all EU member states, it has already eliminated tariffs on nearly all goods traded between Canada and Europe. That means everything from Canadian food products to manufactured goods can compete more easily in one of the world's largest economies. For Canadian businesses, this is a game changer. Traditionally, industries have focused on the U.S. simply because it was the easier option. Shared language, geographic proximity, and existing trade agreements made selling to the U.S. more convenient than looking overseas. But with political uncertainty making trade with America less reliable, European markets are becoming an increasingly attractive alternative. Of course, the shift isn't without its challenges. Despite CETA's benefits, ratification has been slow. Some European countries, including Italy, Ireland, and Poland, have yet to approve the agreement, citing concerns over corporate influence, food safety standards, and national sovereignty. Brexit has also complicated matters. The UK was one of the first countries to ratify CETA, but since leaving the EU, Canada has had to negotiate a separate trade deal with Britain. Still, Canada isn't waiting around. Businesses are already capitalizing on the deal, and if full ratification happens, the European market could become an even stronger alternative to the US. In fact, trade between Canada and the EU has already grown significantly since CETA's provisional implementation, proving that diversification isn't just an idea, it's happening right now. As Canada moves further away from economic dependence on the US, its global trade strategy is becoming clearer. The future is about expanding beyond North America. Asia is becoming a bigger player in global trade, and countries like Japan and South Korea are looking beyond just energy. They're seeking strong trade partnerships in technology, manufacturing, and agriculture. Meanwhile, as the U.S. moves toward protectionist policies, Canada is responding by strengthening its ties with Asian economies. The goal? To diversify and secure multiple pathways for economic growth. For decades, Canada naturally relied on the U.S. as its primary economic partner. There wasn't much reason to look elsewhere. But Trump's tariffs changed that, forcing Canada to do something it probably should have done long ago: diversify. Of course, this shift won't happen overnight, and challenges remain, but the direction is clear. Canada is no longer just an economic extension of the U.S. It's carving out its own space in the global economy, making sure that no single country, not even the United States, can dictate its economic future. Whether this is just a short-term reaction to Trump's policies or a long-term transformation remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the days of Canada relying solely on the U.S. are over. The country is expanding its horizons, forging new partnerships, and ensuring that when it comes to trade and energy, it has more than just one option. This shift could permanently change the balance of power in North America. For years, the U.S. has relied on Canada for a crucial resource: energy. Canadian oil, gas, and electricity have flowed south in massive quantities, keeping American industries running, homes powered, and fuel prices stable. But as Trump's tariffs push Canada to rethink its economic strategy, the U.S. may soon find itself losing access to the very resources that have given it a competitive edge. Oil is at the center of this shift. Canada has long been the U.S.'s largest supplier of crude oil, providing more than half of its total imports. If Canada continues diversifying its trade partners, the U.S. may have to rethink its own energy security and its approach to its northern neighbor. American refineries, especially those in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are built to process heavy crude, which Canada produces in large quantities. Without that supply, these refineries would have to look elsewhere, possibly to Venezuela or the Middle East, both regions that come with significantly more political and economic risk. But the shift is already happening. Canada's expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline has nearly tripled its capacity to ship oil directly to international markets. Instead of relying almost entirely on U.S. refineries, Canada can now export to Asia, where demand is booming. Countries like Japan and South Korea, eager to reduce their dependence on Middle Eastern oil, are ready to take full advantage of this new supply. And it's not just oil. Natural gas is part of the equation too. While the U.S. is the world's largest natural gas producer, its domestic consumption is rising fast. The rapid growth of data centers, artificial intelligence, and high-tech manufacturing is driving up demand to levels that could soon outstrip supply. For years, Canada has been a key supplier, providing nearly all of the U.S.'s imported natural gas. But now, Canada is shifting its focus to Europe and Asia instead. The European Union, still scrambling to replace Russian gas supplies, sees Canada as a reliable alternative. As a result, Canada is fast-tracking liquefied natural gas, LNG, projects, aiming to export billions of cubic feet per day to European and Asian markets. This shift isn't just about diversification. It's about long-term economic strategy. Canada is making sure that when it comes to energy exports, it has multiple buyers, reducing its dependence on any single country, including the United States. If Canada fully commits to this shift, the U.S. could soon find itself competing for the very resources that once flowed freely across the border. Electricity is another factor that could complicate things for the U.S. For decades, Canada has been a major supplier of clean, low-cost electricity to American states. More than 30 cross-border transmission lines connect Canadian provinces to U.S. states, helping to keep energy grids stable and prices low. But as tensions rise, Canada is rethinking this arrangement. Ontario has already announced a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the U.S., directly impacting millions of American homes in states like Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. If more provinces follow suit, the U.S. could see higher energy costs at a time when power demand is only increasing. The geopolitical implications of this energy shift are huge. For years, the U.S. has maintained its position of strength in part because of its access to cheap and reliable Canadian resources. Losing that advantage would force Washington to rethink its entire energy strategy, potentially making it more dependent on OPEC nations or volatile energy markets. At the same time, Canada's decision to diversify its exports isn't just about retaliating against U.S. policies. It's about long-term security. Being overly dependent on the U.S. has made Canada vulnerable, where a single political decision in Washington can send shockwaves through its economy. By expanding trade with Europe and Asia, Canada is ensuring that no single country has too much control over its energy future. The U.S. isn't ignoring this shift. Even as tariffs remain in place, Washington knows that losing access to Canadian energy would be a major problem. That's why, despite Trump's aggressive trade policies, American officials have been quietly working behind the scenes to keep Canadian energy imports flowing. The decision to impose a lower 10% tariff on Canadian oil, compared to the 25% on other goods, is a clear sign of just how vital these resources are to the U.S. economy. Still, the damage may already be done. Once Canada locks in long-term energy contracts with Europe and Asia, there may be little reason to go back to the way things were. The balance of power in North America is shifting, and this time, Canada is making sure it has the upper hand. Infrastructure investments and trade agreements will solidify these new relationships, making it difficult for the U.S. to simply reclaim its privileged position as Canada's top energy customer. For the first time in decades, the balance of power in North America's energy market is shifting. Canada is no longer content to be a passive supplier, dependent on U.S. policies. Instead, it's taking control of its own resources, seeking partners who value long-term stability over political games. If the U.S. isn't careful, it could find itself on the outside looking in. This isn't just an economic shift, it's a geopolitical one. Energy security has always been a cornerstone of U.S. global strategy, and losing Canada as a guaranteed supplier could force a major realignment in how Washington approaches both trade and diplomacy. The growing rift between Canada and the U.S. isn't just about tariffs or trade policies. It's about a fundamental shift in the balance of power in North America. For decades, the U.S. assumed Canada would always be a reliable partner, a steady supplier of resources, and a country that aligned itself with American economic interests. But Trump's tariffs have forced Canada to rethink that assumption, and the results are becoming clear. What happens when your closest ally decides it no longer needs you? That's the question Washington now faces as Canada speeds up efforts to build stronger trade relationships with Europe and Asia. The immediate effects of these trade tensions have been obvious. Businesses scrambling to adjust, consumers boycotting American products, and political tensions rising. But the long-term consequences could be even more significant. For Canada, this isn't just a short-term reaction. It's the foundation for a more independent economic future, one that isn't so closely tied to U.S. policies. By diversifying its trade partnerships and expanding energy exports beyond North America, Canada is ensuring that it controls its own economic destiny. And that could change the future of North American trade forever. Canada is making sure that no single country can use economic pressure as leverage, a strategy that should have started years ago. But Trump's actions have turned it from a smart move into an urgent necessity. For the U.S., the risks are mounting. If Canada locks in long-term energy deals with Europe and Asia, Washington loses one of its most stable and cost-effective resource suppliers. Oil, gas, electricity, and critical minerals that once flowed freely into the U.S. could instead be redirected to markets offering better trade conditions. American industries that depend on Canadian resources may soon face higher prices or be forced to scramble for alternative supplies. But this isn't just an economic issue, it's a geopolitical one. For decades, American influence has been strengthened by its ability to provide allies with stable energy resources. If Canada shifts more of its exports to Europe and Asia, the U.S. could find itself competing for the very resources it once took for granted. And that shift is already underway. Canadian companies are signing new deals. European nations are looking to Canada as a reliable energy partner, and Asian markets are eager to secure a steady supply of Canadian resources. At the same time, American businesses that once relied on seamless trade with Canada are facing disruptions, increased costs, and a loss of trust in cross-border stability. Some American officials are beginning to realize the danger of pushing Canada away. Even within the Trump administration, there are quiet concerns that these tariffs could backfire, hurting U.S. economic stability more than they harm Canada. The question now is whether Washington will adjust course before it's too late. The decision to impose a lower 10% tariff on Canadian oil, compared to the 25% on other goods, was a clear acknowledgement of just how vital Canada's resources are to the U.S. economy. But whether that will be enough to repair the damage remains to be seen. For Canadian businesses, this moment is both a challenge and an opportunity. While some industries have struggled to adapt to the sudden shift, others have embraced it, seeking new markets and building trade relationships that could last for decades. Canada's energy, manufacturing, and technology sectors are all finding ways to expand beyond their traditional reliance on the U.S., creating a more resilient and self-sufficient economy in the process. The big question now is whether this shift is permanent. Will Canada continue integrating itself into European and Asian markets, or will economic and political realities eventually bring both nations back toward a closer partnership? One thing is certain. This is not just a temporary trade dispute. Trump's tariffs have forced Canada to rethink its entire economic strategy, and the choices being made today will shape the country's future for years to come. The once unshakable U.S.-Canada relationship has changed, possibly forever. And for Americans, the reality is becoming clear. Canada is no longer just a quiet neighbor to the north, passively following Washington's lead. It is an economic power in its own right, proving that it can stand on its own. If the U.S. wants to keep Canada as a close economic partner, it may need to rethink its approach before it's too late. Because once Canada fully establishes itself as a major player in the global market, it may no longer have any reason to look back.